So welcome everyone. It's really fantastic to see you all here. As many of you know, I'm Zooming from South Africa. So we don't have any scheduled load shedding, lack of electricity tonight. But every Zoom I've had so far, it's collapsed in the middle and then reconnected. So if I disappear, David Beltman will just continue and tell you what I think, or where I'm wrong. Yeah. Okay. So this evening is, we will keep to time, which is an hour and a half. And so what I plan to do tonight is to take you through the argument of my recent book. This is the SPCK edition, the Old Testament and God, a big fat book. And if you're in America, you've probably got the Baker academic edition, which is a hard copy. And they look quite different, but it is the same book. So what I'm going to do is take you through the argument, hopefully in about 45 minutes maximum. And maybe Jared and Dave can just monitor me to see that I do that. And then we'll simply open it for Q&A. And if I can just remind you, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions. And if you click on that, you can put your finger up. And that is a way to indicate that you want to ask a question. And then, so I will be presenting and chairing our meeting tonight. Now, if you, and I hope if you haven't got a copy, I hope you get a copy of the Old Testament and God. I hope also that you encourage your friends to do so. You will notice that the book is dedicated to Tom Wright, the British New Testament scholar, who also publishes under his proper name N.T. Wright. But that's Tom Wright is how we know him. And it's dedicated to Tom for his magisterial work in his series of books called Christian Origins and the Question of God. Now, if you're familiar with that at all, they're scholarly volumes, absolutely outstanding in my opinion. And he hasn't yet finished the series. So we're still waiting, I think, for the final volume to be published. Now, and what also delights me tonight is that his German translator, Rainer Behrens, is on this Zoom. So Rainer has wonderfully translated most of Tom's stuff into German and so knows it absolutely intimately. Now, I've long thought as an Old Testament scholar that there's a desperate need for an equivalent to Tom's type of work for the Old Testament. But I wondered, could it be done? And then I wondered, could one person do it, knowing that publishers much prefer a single author than multi-author volumes? And eventually at one stage, I plucked up courage and I approached Tom's originating publisher, SPCK, and it moved very quickly from there through to the contract stage. And then in 2019 to 2020, I was appointed as a visiting senior scholar at Trinity International University in Chicago. And the great blessing of that time was the seminary there, which is known as TEDS, Trinity Evangelical Divinity Seminary, or whatever it is. They are very well known for major expertise in ancient Near Eastern studies. And that was, you know, there've been many times in my work so far on this project where I've just felt completely overwhelmed. And I'll talk about some of that because some of the areas I had to immerse myself as far as I could in ancient Near Eastern studies. And if you know anything about ancient Near Eastern studies, every area continues to explode and to grow. So it's harder and harder to get some kind of sense, however basic, of the different approaches to the world during the time before, during, and during the life of God's Old Testament people in Israel. So that time in Chicago was extraordinarily helpful. And I remember, for example, going to see one of their scholars and saying to him, okay, I've got to now immerse myself in Sumerian studies, one of the most ancient cultures in the ancient Near East and in the world. And then, you know, fortunately, there was someone there who could say to me, this is the most important recent doctorate that you want to consult. So it has been an extraordinary journey, but also delightful, full of amazing discoveries. And I'm amazed myself that the first volume has actually been published. And so I should tell you that the plan, God willing, is that this will be a 4-volume series. And the publisher and I have agreed, or the publishers and I have agreed, that unlike Tom's volumes, the following ones won't get bigger and bigger. Okay, so this is the biggest they will get, and we will keep them at that size. Now, you know, I want to invite you tonight to reflect on the Old Testament and why it is so extraordinarily important, and if there are ways in which in our day we could retrieve the Old Testament for the church and for the world. So those are very strong statements, but they are ones that I have thought about a lot. To really retrieve the Old Testament as 3/4 of the Christian Bible for the church and for the world. That's what I want to invite you to think about. Now, earlier today, of course, I'm in South Africa, so I don't have my library with me, but wherever I go, I leave books behind. So I was just having a look at John Bright's book, The Authority of the Old Testament, which were lectures given in 1959, but published around 1967. And he says this in the foreword: what place does the Old Testament legitimately occupy in the Christian's Bible and in the church's proclamation? What is the place of the Old Testament in the Christian's Bible and the church's proclamation? And then he goes on to say, I had long found myself troubled by the fact that so few preachers, myself included, I fear, really seem to know how to proceed with the Old Testament, or were guided in their preaching from it, if they preached from it at all, by any conscious hermeneutical principles. So that was published in 1967. My own sense, having embarked on this project, is that I'm not sure we are in a very different situation today. So my sense as I emerged out of writing this first volume was the enormity of the vision that the Old Testament presents. And as I hope to explain tonight, the desperate need for the recovery of that vision for the church and the world today. And so in the course of this evening, I'll share some of my discoveries, and I think I'll be able to show their relevance. Now, if you think about Old Testament studies in the mainstream of the West, we are heir to about over 100 years now of unbelievably rigorous historico-critical study of the Old Testament. And the Germans in particular have been extraordinary in this area, and they have scrutinized every particle of the Old Testament with rigor that I think is unprecedented in the history of scholarship. Now, the yields of that have been substantial. And my appeal is not for a pre-critical approach to the Old Testament, but a post-critical one. But I think the one thing that is absolutely obvious is that 100 years plus of this kind of critical approach to the Old Testament has left us with many insights, but with fragments that we don't know how to put back together again. So the yield has been significant, certainly in terms of volume of scholarship and also of many important insights. But I think what it's left us with is Humpty Dumpty, the Humpty Dumpty approach to the Old Testament. He fell off the wall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men have no idea how to put him together again. Now, scholars, of course, once they adjust to that, they sort of continue in that paradigm and work away, examining the fragments that they think they have identified. But a fragmented Old Testament is no help to God's people. If you think that the Old Testament is just a cacophony of myriad voices, then it does nothing really for the church or for the world other, ultimately, than undermine the authority of the Bible. And so I think this is the situation in which we find ourselves. Now, during this 100+ years, there have always been conservative believing scholars responding to it. And I would say, especially in the last 50 years or 100 or 75 years, an extraordinary amount of very rigorous evangelical scholarship has emerged on the Old Testament. And I have no desire to dismiss the enormous gains that have been made in historical criticism and in evangelical scholarship. But one finds oneself wondering if what we have ended up is not a conservative response to work sites that have been determined by historical criticism. In other words, out of modernity emerges approach to the Old Testament, which we can call historical criticism, recognizing that there's a lot of variety within it. Perhaps we should speak of historical criticisms, and then an understandable conservative response showing that one can hold on to the Bible as God's word in all sorts of ways, but often remaining within the contours of a debate established by historical criticism. So what I argue in this book, and of course you don't have to agree with me at all, is that what is desperately needed is a new paradigm within which to do Old Testament studies. And so what I'm appealing for in this first volume is a new paradigm within which we can practice Old Testament studies with all the rigor that is imaginable and possible, but without letting where we work and how we work be determined by historical criticism with its Enlightenment credentials. Now, let me tell you why I think we might need a new paradigm, and this gets to the heart of the matter, because of the very nature of the Old Testament. So one of the things this project made me do is read in areas that I had never read before. I got immersed in ancient Near Eastern studies. You know, us Old Testament scholars, we have so much to deal with that we don't read a lot often in, ancient Near Eastern studies, even as they become more and more specialized. So I discovered, for example, an extraordinary book by Seth Sanders, who I take it as a secular Jewish scholar working on the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament. Now, a book with a title that I would probably not have picked up if I hadn't been doing this project. The title is The Invention of Hebrew. Now, I can see all of you typing furiously as you immediately order it on Amazon, right? No, okay. Because even for an Old Testament scholar, a book with that title gives you pause. But it is a truly extraordinary work. And Sanders says that the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, its literature, is one of unprecedented communicative power in the context of all the literature of the ancient Near East. Let me just repeat that. The Old Testament, its literature is one of unprecedented communicative power amidst all the comparable literature of the ancient Near East. Now, I could elaborate on this, and you can read Sanders. A lot of the literature in the ancient Near East is written by courtiers for kings and the elite and so on and so forth. Here you have a literature written for a whole people. And so these are ways in which, now here is Seth Sanders, a secular Jewish student of the Hebrew Bible, saying unequivocally, there is something truly extraordinary going on with the Old Testament in the context of the ancient Near East. Now, here is my question to you all. Why is it that we do not experience the Old Testament in this way today? If it is true that this is a literature of unprecedented power and there's nothing comparable in the whole of the ancient Near East, I don't think many of us experience the Old Testament that way today. And so the quest that I've embarked on in this ridiculously ambitious project, and part of my appeal tonight is who will help me with it? So, because I think it is going to take a village of scholars to even begin to map out a new paradigm. But my quest in this project is to find an approach to the Old Testament that allows us to hear it in its unprecedented communicative power, to hear it in its full acoustics. So that's what I'm after in this series that I'm working on. Now, what is so extraordinary is that Seth Sanders, as a secular Jew, fingers this incredible aspect of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament and then says, to be scientific, he has to find a naturalistic explanation for this phenomenon. Let me just repeat that. To be scientific, he has to find a naturalistic explanation. Now, you know what I mean by that? An explanation that by definition excludes God. Now, what I want to do is to absolutely agree with Seth Sanders that the Old Testament is unprecedented in its communicative power, but I want to explore the possibility that it is like this because of the God who was immersed in the life of God's Old Testament people, Israel. So far from seeking a naturalistic explanation, my wager, to allude to Pascal in this series, is what does the Old Testament look like, and our understanding of its origins and the way it presents itself as today, if we take God with full seriousness, as the Old Testament itself encourages us to do. So this is, it is a very funny thing to have to explain to people that what I'm trying to do, without being blasphemous, is to let God be put back into Old Testament studies. And of course, you know, coming out of the Enlightenment and modernity, you know, at best, you can have your religion in private, but heaven forbid that your religion should enter into the public spheres of life. And that's the ground out of which historical criticism has emerged and out of which evangelicalism has responded to historical criticism. So I'm saying many were the benefits, but it's a terrible loss if we lose God in the process. So this project is an attempt to honor all that has been achieved in Old Testament studies by historical critics, by evangelicals, not to lose any of their insights, but to say that we need a new paradigm in which God is allowed his place in our account of the origins of the Old Testament and what it is saying to us today. Now, just lest I be misunderstood, I make it very clear that I'm not saying that we can't have other approaches to the Old Testament in the academy. By all means, let the historical critics continue their work. You know, some of them are Christian scholars and so on and so forth. Some of them nowadays you can find just about every type of worldview and faith that work on the Old Testament. There's a pluralism, and I want us to allow that pluralism as long as there's a place at the table as well for this sort of approach, which has God at the center and which works on the premise that the Old Testament is best understood when God is taken with full seriousness by the Old Testament scholar. Okay, now there is in the book, the introduction, a roadmap for the Old Testament and God. So if you don't read anything else, you might want to read that roadmap because it is an attempt for a complex book to explain the argument fairly basically and clearly, a kind of big map that you can refer back to in the course of going through it. What I'm going to do in my remaining time, which I think will be about 15 minutes, is just take you through the 4 parts of the book. So I'm a bad preacher. I don't only have 3 points, I have 4 points. Okay, but there are 4 parts to the book, and so I just want to explain briefly what they are about. Now, part 1 may surprise you. It's all about the question, what should we do with the Old Testament? Now, if you haven't been exposed to biblical studies in the university sector, this may sound like a very strange question to you. But if you have been exposed, you will immediately understand why this question is so important. And I would argue it's important for evangelicals as much as for liberals and people of other Christian persuasions. Because remarkably nowadays, all sorts of things are done with the Old Testament. Some historical critics continue to think that the surface of the text is so broken that the best thing we can do is try and reconstruct the underlying sources, which we don't have. But of course, we're capable of reconstructing them, and then we won't study the surface of the text, we'll study our reconstructed sources. So this kind of thing continues. Now, just think about that. What shall we do with the Old Testament? Reconstruct the sources that we don't possess and then study them, not the Old Testament itself. That's mainstream, and it has been for 100 years in Old Testament studies. So people do all sorts of things. And then when postmodernism came along, you could do almost anything with the Old Testament. And if even nowadays, if you go to Society of Biblical Literature, you'll be astonished at the different things you can do with the Old Testament. You can do a radical feminist reading, you can do a queer reading, you can do a new historical reading, you can do this kind of reading, you can do that kind of reading. So this is sort of endless types of approaches developed under the aegis of postmodernism. Now, and sometimes as well, in our best evangelical circles, I hear people say when they're going to do their doctorate, you must first decide on the method that you're going to use. So choose a method like discourse analysis or something else, and then you apply it to the text that you choose to. Now, on that kind of thing, I myself am with Gadamer, the father of modern hermeneutics. That method, this prioritizing of method is a quintessentially modern move. And method must be subsidiary to dialogue, to listening. So, to cut a long story short, my answer, what should we do with the Old Testament? We should listen to it. Now, if I had the time, I would tell you that very little has been written philosophically on the role of how to listen. And any of us who've had experience counseling or being counseled will know that to listen well is an art. It's not automatic. And when it's ancient literature that comes to us as God's word out of cultures from long ago, then that listening becomes more complex. But my argument is that what should we do with the Old Testament? We should listen to it. And as I develop this, I begin by attending to the geography of ancient Israel. And I focus in on the table of the nations in Genesis 10, and then the fact that scholars have identified two very different types of descriptions of the contours of the land. Now, historical critics have identified this very helpfully, but they tend to see these two types of descriptions as contradictory. And then along comes a fascinating Jewish woman scholar, Wazana, who argues that once you understand that these descriptions of the land are not just cartographic, but that there's a literary dimension to them, then you will see that they do not contradict each other, but are actually both referring in different ways to the same land of Israel. And what I do here is what I try and do throughout the book, which is to identify certain biblical texts, work on them, and then let my approach emerge inductively from those texts. So throughout this volume, I think what you'll find is some pretty serious exegesis going on. Now, what happens when you study the Table of the Nations, and incidentally, that Table of the Nations in Genesis chapter 10, there is nothing comparable in the whole of ancient Near Eastern literature. And so here's one thing that I argue. Here is a political theology in Genesis 10 that is got no parallel in the whole of ancient Near Eastern literature. This is the power. But when did you last hear this? And what does it mean? And it's about nationhood and politics and geopolitics. You know, and here is something that is seminal and waiting to be mined. But we somehow have muted the Old Testament. Disappeared and then it came back. So please let me know if I disappear again. So three dimensions to every Old Testament text: historical, literary, and theological or charismatic is my preference. And charisma means the message dimension of the text, or what the text is announcing to us or telling us. So in my opinion, in the Old Testament and the texts of the Old Testament, it is almost always the kerygmatic that is the dominant aspect. So this is what I call the communicative dimension of the Old Testament. It has a message for us. Okay, but to access the message, you have to explore the historical, the literary, the kerygmatic, and their interrelationship in all texts. So what I'm arguing in this volume is that we need a new paradigm for Old Testament studies along these lines that retains all the strengths of the work that precedes us, but especially redoes the foundations of Old Testament study that have been so shaped by modernity. They have been savaged, but not fundamentally altered by postmodernism. And I think we are now in a position, if we want to unleash that unprecedented communicative power of the Old Testament, we need a new paradigm within which to do our work on the Old Testament. Now, that's part one. What should we do with the Old Testament? And my answer is, we need to learn to listen. We need to learn to listen to the Old Testament. Now, in order to do that well, we will need tools to help us in the task of listening, and that is part two. Okay, that is part two, tools for the task. Now, if you have a look at what I discuss in part two, for many of you, the main things will not be surprising. So I discuss narrative, I discuss literature, I discuss what is involved in reading, I discuss worldview, I discuss history, and I discuss theology. Now, none of you have fallen off your chairs, I imagine, with surprise that one of these are listed there. But let me tell you what far too few Old Testament students realize, that one's understanding of each of these areas is a contested domain. Let me just repeat that. You can't just say, okay, yes, a narrative approach is wonderful, because there are many different views of what is involved in narrative. Okay, so you might know, for example, that a deconstructionist like Derrida, would have a very different view of narrative to a phenomenologist like Paul Ricoeur. So when we say narrative, you say, oh yeah, I know about that. But then we have to say, a bit like with Alistair McIntyre, whose narrative? Which version of narrative? So each of these are very contested domains. Literature, what is the nature of literature? There isn't one view, there's a myriad of views. So if you're going to attend to the literary dimension of the Old Testament, you better have worked out some idea of what literature is and how it works. And then we could go through reading. Okay, so, we may think, oh, reading is the most obvious thing in all the world. But reading has become a very contested area too. Should you read the Old Testament with suspicion as your primary goal? Or should you read the Old Testament with trust as your primary goal? That makes all the difference in the world. So reading is a contested domain. Worldview is obviously a contested domain. History, if you know anything about it, is a very contested domain, as is theology. So while you might recognize all of these, that's just the surface. What I'm trying to say is, if we want a new paradigm, we've got to have a look at the philosophical and ultimately religious roots that shape one's view of these areas. just take history, for example. There's a very good theologian, well, a good theologian who wrote a book on philosophy of history. And he says there really are only two major possibilities today: progress or providence. Now, clearly, a view of history as providence with adequate nuance is a very, very different view of history as progress, as it has come to be understood, or many of the other variants that are available today. So my point is this, that underlying all these tools are epistemologies and ontologies. And I just want to touch on epistemology. So I define epistemology, this big fat word that is very scary, as how to go about knowing something so you can trust the results. Let me just repeat that. Epistemology is how you go about knowing something so you can trust the results. Now, I do not believe that there is any professor who has ever taught a course that didn't assume they were after the truth. Even the most postmodern professor doesn't get up there thinking that the whole course is designed to present lies and falsehood. Now, the problem is, especially in modernity, most professors never tell you what epistemology they're using. It's hidden, it's assumed. But this is what we also know, is that there isn't one epistemology. There are multiple epistemologies. And a smorgasbord, a kind of wonderful gallery of 20th century Christian philosophers have done incredible work in this area and have argued that the Christian scholar is justified in taking his or her beliefs as basic. In other words, while there are good arguments for believing in God, you don't need to first prove God's existence, if that's possible, before you can approach the Old Testament with belief in God as properly basic. And a basic belief is one that you can take for granted without proof. That's the nature of a basic belief. All approaches have basic beliefs. So epistemology, and Alvin Plantinga, for example, has written 3 very important volumes with Oxford University Press on his approach to epistemology called Warrant. And what I am after, so this is going to surprise some of you who've been infected, I think, like many of us, myself included, by postmodernism. My goal is to try and work out how to approach the Old Testament so that we can know it truly. The goal is to know the Old Testament truly, to hear its message accurately. Now, there's hardly a more outrageous thing you can say nowadays in much biblical studies. And note, I'm not saying I've achieved it, but I am saying that is the goal. And so epistemologies and ontologies underlie all these areas like narrative, literature, reading, worldview, history, and theology. And so I've tried to develop a toolbox that has got tools in it where they've been thought through from a Christian perspective so that they can be yielded and wielded in work on the Old Testament in a way that fits with the nature of the Old Testament. Okay, so very quickly, parts 3 and part 4. Part 3 was the hardest thing for me to write because in it, I survey, I think it's 9 of the worldviews of the nations around Israel in the history of the ancient Near East. And it was so hard to write, firstly, because there's a vast literature in Egyptology, Assyriology, study of Babylon, There's different schools and Sumerian studies and so on and so forth. So it was incredibly challenging, albeit wonderfully invigorating, to dive into all these areas. So that was one reason why it was so hard to do. The second reason was the literature that I read generally wasn't answering the questions I was asking. So I wanted to know, what is the Egyptian view? You know, if you think of James Sire's Characteristics of a Christian Worldview, what is prime reality for Egyptians? You know, what is at the bottom of it all? What is the Egyptian view of creation? What is the Egyptian view of the human person? What is the ancient Egyptian view of history? What is the ancient Egyptian view of law? And you soon run into some very interesting things. We have never discovered an extant law code from ancient Egypt. We have never discovered an extant law code from ancient Egypt. Now, we don't know whether that is because they were all written on clay and therefore succumbed to history, or whether, as Mayor Sternberg suggested to me in Tel Aviv when I visited him years ago, that in a culture where the king is a god, you don't need law in the codified way. But so this was what I did. Now, personally, I think this aspect of the book can be done much better. I hope many other scholars will do much better than I've done. But I realized the importance of this when at a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals bookstore in South Africa, years ago, I discovered a book published in the 1950s called The Intellectual Adventure of Ancient Man. No one had told me about it, and it was dynamite. It's now receiving fresh attention in a lot of circles, but in it, a bunch of Chicago scholars did what I'm trying to do. They tried to set the worldview of Israel against that of ancient Near Eastern cultures. And what that does is it allows you to start to see the ways in which the Old Testament speaks with unprecedented power. Now, at the end of that section, I discuss Jan Assmann, the Egyptologist's notion of the Mosaic distinction. And Assmann argues controversially that in the Old Testament, you find something that you don't find in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the view that there's one true God and the other gods are false. And so I have a discussion about that. And then this foray into the worldviews of the ancient Near East leads on to my final section, part 4, The God Who Approaches, which is a study of God, and especially Yahweh or Adonai, as he comes to us in the Old Testament. Now, I want to conclude because my time is up and Dave or Jared will soon be probably muting me if I'm not careful. Just to tell you some of the extraordinary things that I discovered on this journey. So I'm just going to give you 2, but I think whether you're an American, whether you're in South Africa like me, or other parts of the world, you might understand why this is dynamite. In all the ancient Near Eastern cultures, king and law go hand in hand. So the gods and the king are inseparable from each other, but it's never the gods who promulgate law, it's always the king. Let me just repeat that. In all the ancient Near Eastern cultures, you always find God and king are inseparable. So temple and palace just go together out of the mists of history. And the gods are concerned for justice, some of them, although they do all sorts of bizarre things. But it's always the king who promulgates law, not the gods. Now, one of, therefore, the most extraordinary things about the Old Testament is its ambivalence towards kingship. See, and here you start to see where this is so important. You know those narratives in the first part of Samuel where they want a king like the other nations? Well, you know, this is absolute dynamite, because what is being brought into discussion is the very nature of kingship. Kingship is not assumed. It doesn't just carry along with the gods. So those early chapters of Samuel, it's just absolute, in the context of the ancient Near East, this is complete dynamite. The whole notion of political leadership is under scrutiny. And in Deuteronomy and early Samuel, there's tremendous ambivalence towards kingship. So the political connotations of that are just epochal. And then who is the lawgiver in the Old Testament? It is never the king. It is always Yahweh. Again, this is absolutely unprecedented. So you have something going on here amidst Israel, the small ancient Near Eastern nation that is truly, absolutely interesting, fascinating, and exceptional. Now, I hope, by the way, Americans, and if there are South Africans on this, that what you are hearing are the origins of the fact that law is king and not the king is law. And in America in recent years, and certainly here in South Africa, we've seen frequent attempts by politicians to operate as though they are above the law, as though they are the promulgators of the law. That is to take our cultures back to Egypt. And it is not the way of Yahweh. Now, the other thing, Chris Wright very wisely said to me in relation to some of my work, Craig, go and have a look at Gottwald's work again. Gottwald does, he's a sort of Marxist Christian who does sociological analysis. But man alive, it really blew me out of the water. So let me tell just, and I'll finish with this. What Gottwald says, he speaks of Yahweh very unhelpfully, I think, as a servo mechanism. Yahweh is not a servo mechanism, he's the living God. But nevertheless, what Gottwald explores is the impact of Yahwism on society. And you know one thing it does? In the ancient Near Eastern cultures and their myths, they are awash with sexuality. Even Sumeria, which is one of the kinder, more moderate, the whole creation story is with Ki and An having this sex where they're screaming and shouting, and it's the sex that gives birth to the other gods and then to the universe. So ancient Near Eastern mythology is awash with sexuality. It's a highly sexualized culture. What does Israel do? Has a very high view of sex, but it desexualizes the culture. Sex has its place gloriously within the marriage relationship, but not in the way, it's not inherent in God in the way that it is amidst the ancient Near East. Now, whatever our view of what is going on in our culture today, I think this is a very powerful word. Amidst cultures that are trying to sexualize children and are awash with sexuality, that is a move back to Egypt, back into the worst parts of the ancient Near East. Whereas what we see here in Israel is a desexualization of the culture with sex as a good gift within the marriage relationship. Now, I'm going to leave it there with my hope that that whets your appetite sufficiently and also leads to some good discussion.